Hey everyone, it's good to see you again. Hi, thanks for waving. Yeah, that's awesome. So today I think we're gonna do something quite different. Well, I hope that each time has been different. But this time I want to start our conversation off, and I actually do want to leave a lot of space for conversation today. Since in the last 2 hours that we shared together, I felt that I don't know how you feel, but we were lacking time for discussion, or at least there was a continuous flood also in my email box, which is great actually, of questions that had spilled over or were surplus to the hour or the hour and a half that we could spend together. So I just want to share a few thoughts with you, which always becomes longer, but I now have a script to stick to. I actually will read some text, which will help me keep time. So I hope you're doing well. I'm just gonna do another thumbs up moment, or thumbs down. Okay, great. Maybe. Okay, I want to share some part of a performance with you. It's very short. Well, whatever. It's very text-based. Let's say it like that. Some of you may have heard that if you want, you could have some candles with you, or candles ready. If you don't have them near, it would be a waste to miss out, but just so you know. I'm just going to start, okay? One day I'll grow up. I'll be a beautiful woman. One day I'll grow up. I'll be a beautiful girl. One day I'll grow up. I'll be a beautiful woman. One day I'll grow up. I'll be a beautiful girl. But for today I am a child. For today I am a boy. For today I am a child. For today I am a boy. One day I'll grow up. I'll feel the power in me. One day I'll grow up. Of that I'm sure. One day I'll grow up. I'll know a womb within me. One day I'll grow up, feeling full and pure. Years ago, before I went to university, I had a job as an overnight watch at a nursery home. It was in the Netherlands and it was called Achterwacht, an extra to the nurse on night shift. I'd arrive usually after my rugby practice, not far from there, do a round, locking doors and windows through the damp, smelly kitchen, checking the emergency exits. Then I would pick up a phone from the nurse's office and retreat in my room at the top level of the building. After making the bed and taking a shower, I'd go to sleep with the phone next to my ear. Very rarely, the nurse would call and wake me up to help her stabilize a person who fell, or because she was very busy with one resident and another couldn't go. I remember the sound of elderly trying to pee, the drops not becoming a stream. One night, the nurse called because someone was in the process of dying. Other residents needed her care, and I had to keep the dying man company. Don't worry, wait for their family. His daughter should be here soon. I held the stranger's hand as he was gasping for air. His child did arrive in time. Each morning, usually after a good night of sleep without interruption, I would return the phone to the nurse's office. I'd look on the whiteboard in the room, used for notifications, and sharing information between the nurses, smoothing one's nurse shift to another. Sometimes a name, number, and a cross would be written on the whiteboard. That night, while I made 10 euros an hour sleeping on standby, someone had died. I would take a picture. I wanted to hold their names before they would write with another resident. I hope to witness the process of dying, instead of death being a final mark. I collected the names and lost the phone. I realized I should have shared my screen with you. Are you seeing the screen? Thanks. So last year, at the beginning of 2019, I started another kind of collection. I noticed that the only section that I still read of the Dutch newspaper NRC is the page for obituaries. Now, I'll show you, I still do it, read the page for obituaries. So this is the paper, and this is somewhat how they look. I also have, and the pages for obituaries have actually multiplied since the COVID-19 crisis. And in this ritual of reading the obituaries, I created both a torment as well as a relief for myself. I will share more about that. As obituaries are not the same everywhere, I hereby share one of those pictures. I should describe, as you can see, there's a name and a birth date, the name of the date of dying, and you might also notice that in the newspaper that I am checking these obituaries in, the birth date, the exact date, is always known. Often, this one doesn't have it, but often there is a motto or slogan that is on top of the person's name. Maybe some poetry, I am the captain of my soul, for example. Something that describes that describes the person, that goes along with their affinity and who they are. And after the announcement of death, you will see that people, the family will follow. So often there's a partner, there's friends or kin, but usually it is name-related family and in-laws. And usually there are couples, and then their kids, and then sometimes their offspring. From January 2019 to now, the Saturday's newspaper is my most stable rhythm in a current roaming life. Well, that current roaming life has stopped. But when I'm not in the Netherlands, I ask people to look for the paper or to keep the paper for me. Each week, I browse the paper, looking for obituaries, looking for LGBT people. I'm looking for glitches in this overwhelming display of heterosexual family trees. When I spot a gay couple, I feel happy, and I don't know really why. It could be seen as an affirmation of our existence as LGBTQ people, but it denies it in the same gesture. First of all, because any queerness that exists is squeezed out through this formal format, the gray paper, the straight lines, the listing. Another problem is that I can only recognize gay people when they appear as a couple. Single people I cannot identify. No one in the obituaries I saw is celebrated for LGBTQIA activism or explicitly called gay. So to be clear, I'm not only looking for people who died who appear gay because they have a same-sex partner, like the one that you see here. I'm also looking in the family for same-sex couples. I can suspect when someone died without a partner and when some of the words to describe them has a little extra glitter. A hint through old-fashioned euphemisms, such as he had a striking personality, lived a flamboyant life, or she was a very headstrong woman. I decided to exclude those uncertain obituaries from the collection unless I could find proof of gayness through Googling the person. None of the single people were visibly online like that. And therefore I ended up only identifying people who exist gay in couple form. Now, in many of my work, I strongly argue against the notion that couplehood confirms existence or value, as the work that Adam just introduced. But in my search for LGBTQ people in obituaries, I depend actually on this classification. Another problem, I find gay couples based on their names. Therefore, my search is also compliant to the gender binary. As you may have seen, I myself write my name as Simone with the E at the end between parentheses or brackets, because I consider it quite strange that we mark someone by birth, then also naming this person without questioning, and one can then suspect someone's gender before even meeting the person. So of course with Simone, it becomes Simon or Simone, which in many countries is then the male name is Simone and Simon, and the female name is Simone. When I would encounter a so-called unisex name, I would Google, so same-sex couple, I would Google the person and check their picture when I wasn't sure about the gender of the name. And of course, that is another failed methodology in wanting to know about someone's gender, looking at their picture. It is no coincidence that the obituaries in NRC newspaper follow the announcements of marriage and births. I think you'll see here in the paper, these are the birth announcements. Almost all announcements of these birth of children are gender marked, whether it being through the name parents chose for their child, or by saying they are so happy with their daughter or son. No children are born. You enter the world with, it's a boy, it's a girl. This naming signifies the flesh-deep performativity of language. When you see something, or when you say something, when you say something, you do something. My flawed methodology in the search for queers neglects all of those who live in a heterosexual couplehood, but who don't identify as straight. All those single appearing people who in my classification become not really noteworthy. All of those trans people who chose a gender passing name, and it bypasses LGBTQ people who are deliberately excluded from the family tree. My search in the obituaries in the Dutch newspaper also affirms the heteronormative acceptance of gays in the Netherlands, where people are proud to include their gay family members as a sign of open-mindedness and as a reason to be racist against certain religions and migrants, especially Islamophobia, both whitewashing gayness and using LGBT politics in support of right-wing nationalist ideology. The liberalist mindset of no problem here always means no other near. So I have possibly taken queerness away from people with my urge and desire to find LGBTQ in this hetero-dominated space. Classification, categorization is flawed in itself. And therefore, spotting a gay person in the paper is never really a relief. It might be exactly how it is always. Developing the so-called gaydar, seeing someone like you, meeting the other queer in the room or in the Zoom. Many of those moments are marked with relief that's at the same time marking a lack of relief. A relief that reminds of the pressure that is called the usual, affirming the normal. No queerness is affirmed through my collection. There is no truth in visibility. Is it possible to document the gap without closing it? At best, I have documented hints towards infinite layers of disappearance, shadowy queers who will never appear in a newspaper that charges €500 to publish a medium-sized obituary. Because that is completely part of this story. These obituaries come from NRC, known in the Netherlands as a classical good paper. The newspaper is a sir smoking a cigar, a father, never a daddy, read by a cultural elite. It was also the newspaper that I grew up around. Whatever non-normative desires may be present inside the beds, dungeons, and houses of the people reading this paper, their socioeconomic status, the zip code where they get their paper delivered marks a long life expectancy with no sudden eviction due to gentrification. Should someone who falls repeatedly in love with women but who lives a straight life even be called actually gay? Those involved in queer archiving are continuously in doubt. Am I outing someone beyond their wish, time, their consent, and what is the purpose of legibility? Also the question whether beyond their language. Think, for example, about Gloria Becker's book. I'll show it. Keeping up with the tradition of tactility. In this book, Gloria Becker has done a participatory anthropological study as a Surinamese Dutch woman. She's lived in Suriname and lived with traditional working class women who practice the mati work. And mati comes from maatje, which in Dutch means something like buddy. And it comes from surviving the ships together over the transatlantic slave route. So maatje comes from there, mati. And these are women who live together in non-monogamous ways. So they live with several women, often sexual relationships, sometimes also with men. Not all in the same house, but in different houses. And Gloria describes this practice of the mati work in relationship also to the Winti religion, Winti coming from wind, where you might be visited by a spirit who might ignite you to want to lay down with women. So if you're a woman wanting to lay down with women, this is because you are visited by a spirit that wants to lay down with women. And it can also mean that maybe tomorrow or next week, you are visited by another spirit, and then you might want to lay down with men or with no one. So here you see also how the Winti religion coincides with another kind of expression of sexuality, where this expression of sexuality is not static, and where it's also not named. So there's not a claim of saying, I am a mati woman, I am lesbian, I am polyamorous. So this is how we would I, from my lens, would probably classify these women if I would see their lives. But they do not identify as such. So they do not say, I am lesbian or I am mati, but I do the mati work. So, of course, this question of when you are archiving or when you're going through the archive, which also ties us back to the first class on rewriting history. Are we by putting names on them? Are we by using the lens that some of us think is a natural lens to look at sexuality? Also thinking, of course, on the anal terror class for those who were there. Are we really doing justice to the history that we're narrating? It's a boy, it's a girl. One day I'll grow up. Who will verbalize your end? My partner is 30 years older than I am. If she dies, I will be nearly a child in her family's eyes. A child, says Jack Halberstam, is where queer rebellion is allowed. Her family and long-term friends will arrange her funeral. And I fantasize about organizing a separate ritual. But probably I will participate in the formal funeral. Probably I'll engage and commit to that feeling of alienation in a structure that's made to signify belonging. hoping that there's someone out there to spot the glitch. I've been thinking, since I've been collecting these obituaries, about an intervention, a way to mess up the obituary page. For example, by imagining historically possible but legibly unknown queer figures into the paper by announcing they're dead and describing their lives in obvious LGBTQ terms, celebrating their activism, their promiscuity, their messiness, their criticisms. I'm thinking about applying for an art fund for the newspaper's fee, creating different email addresses from which I'll hand in the different obituaries. All that to disrupt the overwhelming display of heterosexual family trees, to mess with the portrayal of accomplished lives. Could it even be done in such a formal space? Should it? Is this paper space of hetero advertisement worth our contamination? You belong, you are part, it's the economy of the last word. If your family reads a formal newspaper or attends a religious center for your funeral, it doesn't matter how you have lived your life. After you die, you might still be taken in, your refusals washed away to fit in silence, you belong. Your chosen name may not be used, your pronouns may be wrong. It's the economy of the last word. So in February this year, I visited the trial against Osman Kavala in Turkey, near Istanbul. And the trial is also known as the Gezi Park trial. It's 16 people who were accused of overthrowing the government because of their involvement at the Gezi Park protest in 2013. And you might have read about it. After being released on paper, he was actually detained again with new charges. And before this spectacle happened, the judges asked Osman Kavala for his last words, and Kavala refused. He said, "I have no last words in a trial that cannot be called a trial." He refused, but still he was part of it. So it's not so much about these specific obituaries in this specific newspaper. That's the part of the story that's personal to me. But the authority over our memories and stories, often disguised as care and belonging, how can we shift and regain power structures, especially when holding a place within these power structures? Especially when part of you, always this part of you, is being heard as your main being and modified into one tone and tune. So here I'd like to invite you, if you have a candle, I'm just gonna light one for those who have passed on. So this is, of course, one of those moments where you'd like to be in the room together, to smell the match, or to smell the candles, or to feel the warmth. Which makes me immediately wonder about the kind of rituals of mourning and grief, or any kind of ritual that we can create together, meeting each other online. Because I have been feeling intimacy with you all. I don't know how it feels for you, but as a group, I cannot, of course, say everyone, but as a group, I have felt your presence throughout the last 2 classes. But I really wonder on those moments and those rituals that are so identified by being together, how we could create ways, which is also why, of course, I take out the obituaries, which, with their sort of straight formality, I wonder again, like, how is that a ritual of grief if it's mostly an announcement? I think as an exercise, I wanted to propose also to circle back to our first class. It's an exercise, again, that I'm going to give an abstraction in the sense that it's not something we can do now, or we don't have to do this now, but it's something maybe that you will take along. It's this question of, what if you would pick a person who does not exist and create a in memoriam, like the in memoriam you have seen throughout. And you would create an in memoriam for them in the way that would, for you, narrate, commemorate, celebrate a part of history that you feel has not been represented enough. I think it's especially good to use fiction for that, because it allows you, again, as Saidia Hartman has done, as was in the first class, I'm sorry for those who weren't there, to refer to that, using her imagination to fill in the gaps of the ways that we document history. And maybe also to share with you, you're still on my screen, right? Great. I guess you have seen Looking for Langston passing by in the screen earlier on. I don't know if some of you know Looking for Langston, a film by Isaac Julian. I'm like skipping through your faces to see if I can see nods or not. Seeing some no's. So Isaac Julian made a film called Looking for Langston. It was, let me see when it was, I think it was 1989 when it came out. And it's basically an in memoriam, a commemoration ritual of Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was a Black American poet, also writing about his gay experiences. And the whole movie becomes actually an in memoriam, becomes a staging of his funeral. And the funeral itself is also a party. And in the movie, there's, for example, James Baldwin, and there's Hilton Als. Audre Lorde also worked on the film, and there's a voiceover by Langston Hughes himself, even though he was already dead. He died in the 60s, 67, I believe. But it's old recordings of his voice. And yeah, I'll show you, I'll give you some sound with that. It's just a little clip on Isaac Julian's. So here you see that the funeral of Langston Hughes is created. That there's the fictional element of people meeting, the celebration that can only happen when you do not take chronological temporality or chronological time, in the sense that all of these different figures are coming together, even though some of them have already died, some of them are not there. So here you create a kind of meeting beyond the realism, so to say. I think another example would be The Watermelon Woman by Cheryl Dunye. Don't know if this is familiar to you, this film. I think it came out in the late 90s. And Cheryl Dunye has basically created a character that she works in a video shop, a rental shop, and she sees a black woman in the movies that she's fascinated by, but she notices that all the black actors being starred in the movie are described not by their name, but by their act or whatever they are doing. In this case, the Watermelon Woman. So there's an actress who is called the Watermelon Woman and not by her name. And Cheryl Dunye starts. It's a fictional documentary, the movie that she made. She starts seeking for this woman. She starts to go into archives. She starts to talk to people, and eventually she finds out that this woman is called Faye Richards. And Faye Richards was actually, just like Cheryl Dunye, the director, a lesbian woman. She became an activist. She was not recognized in the movies because there wasn't enough space for black women acting. And she starts narrating, Cheryl starts narrating the story of the Watermelon Woman, Faye Richards. But the interesting part about this movie is, besides it being a great movie, is that Faye Richards itself is also a fictional character. So instead of digging up the story of a real person, which of course there would be enough real people who are forgotten in the current narration of history, she decides to take an extra sort of ownership and creates this character of Faye Richard. And you might be familiar with the work of Zoe Leonard as a visual artist. And Zoe Leonard has created actually all of the pictures that are in the movie of Faye Richards. So you get, as a viewer, you get a full narration of this Faye Richards. You start to get attached to this person. You're like in this search for Faye Richards, and then eventually you find out that Faye Richards herself was also invented. For Cheryl Dunye, in order to narrate the story that she felt is missing from history, the stories of Black lesbian women in the US. And it's really, I think it's really powerful to commemorate the gaps through fiction. Because also thinking back maybe of our first class on rewriting history, is the moment that you're starting to dig up histories that you think are actually there, and you're saying it's nonfiction, it is actually there. There's also, of course, another element of exclusion happening when you have found a certain person whose history has not been documented. Then of course you're still negating, for example, people around her. And this is not to say that it's a bad methodology to dig up these histories, but to create fictional histories in order to tell the story that you think is missing, I think is a very powerful structure. I'll just show you a small clip of Cheryl Dunye, but you should just see the movie.
Hi, I'm Cheryl, and I'm a filmmaker. I'm not really a filmmaker, but I have a videotaping business with my friend Tamara, and I work at a video store, so I'm working on being a filmmaker. The problem is I don't know what I want to make a film on. I know it has to be about Black women because our stories have never been told. So I've been renting movies. No, I haven't been renting movies, but I get movies from the video store that I work at, and I've taken all these films out from the 30s and 40s with Black actresses in them, like Hattie McDaniel and Louise Beavers. And in these films, in some of the films, the Black actresses aren't even listed in the credits, and I was just totally shocked by that. So in this one film that came into the store, Plantation Memories, I saw the most beautiful Black mammy named Elsie. And I just had to show this, so watch.
Missy. Master Charles is coming back for sure. I know he is. Oh, yes, Mr. Barber, I know he is. I prayed about it all night long. This morning, his little angel told me that he was coming back. Back to you.
Her name, the Watermelon Woman. That's right, Watermelon Woman. Is Watermelon Woman her first name, her last name, or is it her whole name? I don't know, but girlfriend has it going on. And I think I've figured out what my project's going to be on. I'm going to make a movie about her. I'm going to find out what her real name is, who she was and is, everything I can find out about her. Because something in her face, something in the way she looks and moves is serious, is interesting. And I'm going to just tell you all about it.
So there you are. Yeah, and just to mention again, all of the material that features the Watermelon Woman is made by Zoe Linnard. So they made a whole archive of this non-existing person to shed a light on all of these existing but non-visible histories. So I'm going to invite you into the conversation. Maybe you want to respond to what has been shared so far. Maybe if you were part of the first class, you're seeing some links to the way we talked about rewriting history. I don't know if some of you have. I see now, sorry, I'm opening the chat since it's still quiet on your side. I also made another document of references. So it also references the Watermelon Woman, as well as Isaac Julian's movie Looking for Langston, as well as Zoe Linnard's archive.
All right, so I guess hi. So I guess the approach we'll take is that if you have questions for Simone, if you want to drop them in the chat, and then we'll flag them up as they come along.
You can also refer back to our last times. That's why I thought it would be nice to have some time to talk, since last time we did talk a lot. So maybe now we're all a bit quiet from what I shared now, but
Rupert, yeah, Rupert, if you want to jump in first with your question.
Yeah, thank you again for the fantastic and really quite touching presentation. And I guess this idea of commemoration and mourning in terms of passing and death plays in a lot of themes of a project I'm working on, which is looking at contemporary sort of, I guess, Western European ways to mourn, and how we've sort of lost any sort of like tradition of truly mourning compared to other cultures which have very performative mourning rituals, like keening in Ireland, which is, and the wailing. I know there's a lot of Arabic cultures that also have these things. And this idea of commemorating online, and because I was going through my Facebook settings, and there was this commemoration setting which I'd never seen before, where you can choose how you're commemorated when you die, like what happens to your account. And I think it was interesting you asking us about this connection, because when you lit the candle to me, that I had a very intense emotional reaction to that, which is bizarre. And I guess into thinking into the future, and this your first talk about monuments is like, what will our future monuments be? I think it's quite scary if we will only sort of commemorate and monumentalize each other in non-present ways, i.e. online. So I guess I'm commenting on that. It's not really a question, but maybe you have some ideas about this, or how we can regain in our sort of Western European culture longer and deep felt forms of commemoration and ritual of passing that then will be in future generations passed down. If that makes sense, sorry.
No, I think everything makes sense. I'm glad you say that that you could feel the moment of the candle in a way. I think that it's interesting to me that on an embodied level, I can feel in my body that which is a bit weird maybe to say when you are the one speaking, but that I'm also like having another kind of energy than what I started with, by bringing people in the room that have passed. But I think it also reminds me, and this is not talking about a commemoration ritual, but this is a question of online togetherness. That it reminds me that earlier on, for example, also with the first class, what I would usually do, showing the movie of Claudia Rankine, I had wanted to give a warning that there would be the N-word in the film that I showed, because it's citing all these curses and offenses, and I didn't do that. And this is not necessarily an apology, but it's a realization that when you are not in the room as bodies, it becomes somehow easier to sort of step over these moments of gut-wrenchingness or something like that, right? Like these moments of affect, the moment that you can feel that the affect of words become different in an online context. That would be for me. I don't know how you're feeling that right now, since you've been online so much, but it is very interesting. At the same time, I would love to hear maybe some more perspective, whether other people what they felt, because it would of course be interesting to see that we can actually share a collective affect or something similar to each other, or create an intimacy in that. And in terms of commemoration, another reference that I put in the document about this class is also by Judith Butler, On Grievable Lives, not ungrievable, but on grievable lives. So which lives are considered in a societal sense lost when they are lost. So of course, for example, a movement like Black Lives Matter immediately refers to that, right? When a Black life in the US context, but in many other contexts, is lost and is not seen as a life being lost, then what does the being before being lost mean? Right? When something that's lost is not considered a loss, how alive were you then before? And of course, Judith Butler makes the distinction between institutional grievability and the personal affect. So it's not to say that when there is not a societal appreciation of some lives, that people are not appreciated in their near proximity or in their near circles. But on a societal level, we can say that some lives are more grievable than others. So also speaking, for example, about the way that the lives of military people or soldiers are commemorated, while the lives of the people that have died under the soldiers' supervision are not commemorated. People who are dying in the sea right now are not being commemorated. They're not being given names, and even the number, even though it's so overwhelming, like what do we do with a number like that? So besides having rituals on a sort of personal level in an online time, which would be an interesting question, there is also, of course, the question that we have always been dealing with abstract grieving, in the sense that some people have tried to draw attention to those people who are considered non-grievable lives, right? So some people have tried to give faces or names to the people who are otherwise just numbers on an institutional level. So we have some experience of living with this sort of abstract grief. And I think that the same question here circles. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question at all, but I think something similar circles back to the things we talked about in rewriting history, is this question of form and aesthetic. Like, which media do we use? Do we LGBTQ people want to be in a newspaper between these straight lines, right, on a gray fucking paper, or do we want to find other kinds of forms? And then we also get to the question which we talked about previously, ephemeral memory, ephemeral commemoration, or Rupert, the ones that you just mentioned, where the sort of performative rituals are much more prevalent. And this is such a interesting question, I think, when we're talking about grief, is we have to be very careful to not assume that a sort of North European Western approach to grief with a certain silence and sobriety is a dominant one, because it's actually not, you know. But this is the space that this is also why I mentioned that this is the paper that I grew up around, to contextualize this question in relationship to this specific space. So I'm not seeing any questions popping in.
Antoine, you had one from earlier in the chat at 1:41. Did you want to?
Yep, indeed.
Take that?
It was more about the second part, about the invisibility of Black people in the movies, and I was wondering, there was two, like the Bechdel test, which is a test to check if like two women with like could speak one with another in a movie without mentioning the existence of a guy. And I was wondering if such tools existed. So because like French people have been like writing about the female gaze, which is not considering like actresses like part of bodies or only being the wife of the character. And I was wondering if there was something about white gazing, how cinema only look at white people and like consider colored people as only as a function, like sellers or domestic, voilà. So question about the tool like Bechdel test like and white gazing.
I'm seeing a response. Does somebody else want to respond to that? Because so the Ellison-Bechtel test is just a method. It's just a few rules in a way, right? Like, it's not an actual test, of course. It's a question of like how many women appear in a movie, and do they talk, like you were saying, do they talk long enough not about a man of their interest? In terms of the white gaze, there's a lot that has been written and talked about, and Cheryl Dunye is part of that. I think it would be really interesting. I don't know if there's a so-called test. There's a lot to find on this in terms of, I'm also thinking about the podcast called Still Processing by Wesley Morris, and someone else is in there too, speaking about Black Panther. And then they talk about, in this movie, they talk about so it's the Marvel movie, but they talk about the economics behind it. And I think it's really important, as you're talking about whether it's the male gaze or the white gaze, to talk about economics when it's considering to film or visual culture. So I think it's really important to look at that, like, where does the money go? Who receives money also for the work that they do? And then you get a little bit separate from this idea of like, what do I see? But you get much more into the structural inequality that's there. But I would really recommend looking up also Isaac Julian and Cheryl Dunye, especially in coincidence. You will find a lot of videos, etc., on YouTube where they talk on different panels, which is quite interesting. Also, because
can you write the name on the chat, please?
Yeah, so it's also all in the document that you should have, but maybe you don't have it because Nelly is not.
The document should be in the University of the Underground calendar. It was also should also be linked in the email that got sent out over the weekend. If you received that. If not, just drop me a line at hello@universityoftheunderground.org and I'll shoot that through.
I think that I've updated it. That's why I'm like referring to it as a new document. But I will send it also to Adam so that you will definitely get it. Yeah.
Cool. We've got about 6 minutes left. So, Shea Mali, did you want to ask your question? Are you here?
Yeah. Hi.
Awesome.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I just wanted to ask about I guess like with the candle and that being a ritual again, and us doing it individually in our homes behind the screen. But I guess like there's also the option of not having to do it because there's no one kind of being in the physical room with you, doing it with you, or kind of you don't share the experience with other people. It's more you have to do all of the work individually. In the same way, like with kind of the option of doing protesting online on social media or in other digital spaces is also kind of the option not to do like the harder work of being physically present and doing a physical protest. Like, what are your thoughts on kind of making people kind of feel more empowered or accountable to do kind of physical protesting as opposed to just not, or like kind of hiding behind a screen or doing it online?
Well, I think it's very, thank you for that. I think it's very important to not fall into the trap of a binary between the screen as a passive space and the sort of physical public space as an impassive space, or as an active space. Especially since I also remember we talked a little bit about this before, is that when the internet came up, so to say, there was a lot of feminist optimism to think that with internet we would be disembodied and therefore we would not, as women bodies, there would be less discrimination. And then of course this appeared not to be true. So here you see that maybe the question of public space being also online, instead of seeing the online space as a completely separate one. However, I do also actually share your worry. But I think I now saw something where they protested in Tel Aviv against Netanyahu with 1.5 meters distance. I'm gonna look that up after this class. I just saw it passing, and I'm interested in this idea of, because there's something very forceful about showing up when you're not even able to show up in the ways that we know, so to say. Another recommendation I personally want to look into more and want to learn off more is to really just look at the work by disabled scholars and activists and organizers who have been organizing and gathering and sharing intimacy online way before most of us able-bodied people also started coming online, right? And disabled people have also asked for online classes, for example, and it was never possible, right? There was always this idea of, no, it needs to be physical. And while I myself have an affinity for the physical, I also really think that it's time to listen to those people who know what it's like to be stuck inside the home. So that would be one way. of looking at it, if that makes sense to you.
All right, I think we have time for Fotis's comment, and then we do have to wrap up as we do have another class coming up soon. So I just want to read what Fotis has left in the chat. This fictional rewriting of the gaps is in total accordance to the first lesson's disruptive practice, somehow upgrades it and gives mourning another tone. The invisibility that you described about queer grief was also a big moment 2 years ago here in Athens, when a queer activist and drag queen was murdered in public view and received a normal funeral by the activist's family, dressed as a groom, because this is how a non-married male gets buried here. So this turned out in a counter-reactive party memorial with Madonna songs, which was their favorite, but also it has united the whole community, speaking a lot and protesting a lot with parties and street gatherings for Zaki O, the name of the activist. And Jan, is it all good if I just read out what you've left in the chat as a final thought? Or do you want to read that out?
I think that's a question to Jan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is Jan here?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the houses on the Bal Couture. Maybe you can talk about this, because I think that in the fiction you can rewrite some histories, and this is a real alternative of the community to in real life rewrite some histories, because sometimes the family doesn't know much about you as being a part of LGBTQ, and create your own family. I think is in these communities is a good support.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, I don't have anything to add to that, except for that indeed, like, this is of course also why I referred to what if you are remembered indeed by your family, as was also in Athens, by a name that you didn't chose, or with the pronouns that you do not prefer, right? And then of course there are always options of rituals that are always created. So it's not, this is also why I was careful with this distinction by Judith Butler of the grievable lives, where I think it's a really helpful tool to think about, okay, who is seen as grievable, and what does it say about the way that we portray violence, what we consider to be violence. But when we make this distinction, it should in no way imply that people are not being grieved over, because people always find ways. And I think, yeah, thank you for adding that, actually, Jan.